Good morning to everyone, and it's great to be back here once again. Good morning to the people here, and good morning to those out in Zooming in other places in the world. So it's good to be with you here again today. Back in the early years of the Christian church, there was a man who decided that the Old Testament seemed to be so different to the New Testament that he didn't think it was Christian at all. And so he said, well, that can't be God's word. And so he took it. You could imagine, not that they had Bibles like this, but you could imagine him taking his Bible up and ripping out 2/3 of it. Says, no, it doesn't apply anymore. He also took things out of other books in the New Testament which seemed to indicate that the Old Testament was really important. So he took those out as well. But I want to know, what do we do with the Old Testament? Because I suspect some of us might be a bit like, now that man's name was Marcion, and I think we might be like Marcion a bit and say, I'm not sure quite how to handle the Old Testament. I like talking about Jesus and I like talking about what he's come to do, but I don't quite know what to do with the Old Testament. From time to time, people in being very enthusiastic, and they've come to me and said, I'm going to read right through the Bible. I say, great. Well, they read through Genesis. Yeah, they can handle that. They get about halfway through Exodus and the reading starts slowing down, and by the time they get to Leviticus, they say, I don't understand any of this. It is very hard to read the Bible right through like that unless we understand the context in which I'm reading. So I'm going to be today's sermon, next week, and I come back in August, and we're going to look at 3 sermons based on material in 1 Chronicles. A person told me at 8 o'clock that they'd read 1 Chronicles. It was about 60 years ago. I don't know whether you've read 1 Chronicles or not, but that's one of those things that we might not have put together. I can't think that I've ever heard many sermons on 1 Chronicles. I can't say that now at 10 o'clock because there's some people here who've already heard one sermon on 1 Chronicles, and therefore they would jump up and say, oh yes, I often hear this preached on. So, 1 Chronicles. It's one of those things that you might say, I wonder where 1 Chronicles is. If I said to you, look up 1 Chronicles, you might say, I better go to the index on this one, I think, and you'd find 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles is an interesting one, and 2 Chronicles actually are both very interesting books because they, in our Bibles, in the English Bibles, they appear after 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, and you get to 1 and 2 Chronicles. And sometimes they're called the history books. And we think of them as like that they are part of that whole process. Now, we're misled a little bit because in the Hebrew Bible, 1 and 2 Chronicles don't follow 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. In fact, they're the books that end the Old Testament. And it's not so much giving the basic history, it's much more a reflection on what God's people understood from the past. So we're looking at books that may be written 500 years after the events. It's a reflection back to what has happened to help people understand how they're placed as God's people. Now, when we open 1 and 2 Chronicles, we are to realise that they're written to the people of Israel, but in a very difficult time. God's people, which had been reduced in number and had been attacked over the many years and centuries, had just been in captivity in a place called Babylon, under the Babylonian rule. And yet, amazingly, in about 530 BC, amazingly, they found themselves back in the city of Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. They'd gone back there because the Babylonian Empire had been defeated by the Median Persian Empire, and the head of the Persian Empire had allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. So they'd gone back, and they no doubt would have thought everything's going to be just like it was in the glory days. The glory days of Israel, when King David was the king, when King Solomon was the king, and they were known throughout their known world in what we would call the ancient Near East. And they thought everything will again be like it was. And they got back to Jerusalem and it wasn't. Jerusalem was a ruin. There was no temple there, there was no king. Well, there was a king, but fairly powerless. There was no walls around the city. They were poor and they were hemmed about by people who were enemies. Nothing seemed to be right. God had promised, they said, but I don't see where the promise is fitting. They eventually built a temple, but it was such a poor one in comparison to the one that Solomon had built that the older people cried when they saw it. It was so second rate. And so there are dispirited people living back in Jerusalem. They were encouraged by two people, Ezra, who came and taught them the law of God and rebuilt the temple, and Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and restored the buildings. That's a whole nother story that you can actually read about in the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah. You've got lots of reading that you can do this afternoon or other times. So they had all these expectations. Nothing seemed to be working out. But the writer of 1 Chronicles says, I want you to reflect on the past to understand your present and the future. So he writes 1 Chronicles. I'm going to take up the story in chapter 10. You'll look back and you'll realise why when you open up 1 Chronicles, the first 9 chapters are just lists of names, and we might struggle to get through them. These would have been great interest to the people that were first readers or first listeners to 1 Chronicles. They loved to think, where have we come from? How do I fit into the world? Who are my ancestors? People today still do family trees. I've never had the energy to get past about the first 2 or 3 generations, but there are people who love to sit down and go through the family tree and can tell you all about, well, if that's your thing, then you will understand what 1 Chronicles is doing right at the start. The writer is saying, this is our place in the world. These are our ancestors. These are where we come from. We're not just out of the blue, aliens dumped down. We have a family. So I want to take up the story in about chapter 10, and my focus for these sermons on 1 Chronicles is all on King David. Now, King David lived 500 years before this was written, but the writer of 1 Chronicles wants to say, I want you to think back to King David and his place in God's purposes and what it's going to mean for you here and then on. Well, what do we know about David? David is the very centre of attention for the Old Testament, and then his descendant, great David's greater son, as one person put it, his descendant, King Jesus, is the centre of all the New Testament, indeed the centre of the whole Bible, because all the interest of David focuses forward onto Jesus. They had to learn who they were. If you looked out with your eye, you'd say, we are insignificant, we're an insecure part under the rule of a very powerful nation. And yet, we are the chosen people of God, through whom he is going to bring his promises to the whole earth. What Ezra and the others had to say was incredible. You would never have believed that if you just looked with your eyes. They found the people of Israel, or Judah, the Jews, would have found that very hard to believe just looking around. But their great hope was to say, the Creator God of the whole universe has focused his attention on this particular people and our place in the world. David, as I said, was no longer alive, but I would put it that there was a David-shaped blank in the very heart of God's people, because God had promised that his people would live in his place under the rule of his person, under David. David had been promised that way back. You can read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Well, what do we know about David? It'd be interesting if we had a little test now to say, what do you know about David? I'm not going to, by the way, but we could. What's David like? Well, chapter 10 of 1 Chronicles starts by saying a negative, really. Not about David, but about how we understand David. David is not King Saul. He was the one who followed King Saul. King Saul was the one who was unfaithful to God. But David was the faithful king. And at the end of 1 Chronicles 10, we read this: Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word of the Lord, or even consulted a medium for guidance, and did not inquire of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. David was the faithful man after God's own heart. Way back in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, we read, as David is being spoken to, but now your kingdom will not this is spoken to Saul, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. So David is the man after God's own heart, and the person writing 1 Chronicles says that's the first thing to know about King David, appointed by God as ruler of God's people, and that is going to continue on not only for David, but for David's descendants as well. Always a king related back to King David will rule over God's people. The writer of 1 Chronicles ignores, apparently, some things about David that we know by reading 1 Samuel. David committed adultery with Bathsheba, an adulterer, and then he tried to cover it up by having Bathsheba's husband really murdered, sent into battle and killed. An adulterer and a murderer, a man after God's own heart. How do you put that together? People have pondered about that. And why do we get no talking about David's actions in 1 Chronicles? Is there a whitewash job going on? A revision of history? I don't think it's that. Well, a couple of things to say about that. It's not that. Everybody knew the story of David. It's not that the writer of 1 Chronicles is saying, forget all that. He says, yes, that's what we know about David, but what I want to really emphasise is the description of David as being the faithful one. David failed in his actions. He never lost trust in God and was faithful to him right through his life. And it's that faithfulness and promise that are being picked up. God's king, King David. As I read in chapter 11, verse 2, the Lord your God said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel and become their ruler. God's appointed ruler is King David. Well, there's God's king. And they were to know, the people of Israel, that that's who our king is. And we look forward to being ruled by King David or his descendant. Secondly, God's ruler needs God's people. And this is what we find that the writer of 1 Chronicles says to us. All Israel came together to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And so he's saying God is bringing together the people of Israel to be ruled over by King David. King David's one of them. We are your own flesh and blood, and we've been brought together under your rule, under God's rule. God brings the people to be under the rule of David, who he has selected. Now, once again, the writer of 1 Chronicles isn't giving us all the history. Read back in 1 Samuel and you'll find out that there was almost civil war between some of the tribes who wanted David and some who didn't. It took a long time for all the people to say we are wanting to be under David. But that's not the point that the writer is making. In the same way that he doesn't rehearse everything about David, he doesn't rehearse everything about the people who are now ruled by David. What is important is here is the faithful king ruling over the people who have been gathered. So you have God's king, have God's people, but they need a place to live in. Where is the place that is God-given to David? Well, we read about that in verses 4 to 9 of chapter 11. David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. The Jebusites who lived there said to David, "You'll not get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. When Israel had come into the promised land, they captured much of it, but they never captured this stronghold place because it is a very difficult place to attack. They never captured it. And up to the time of David, it had just remained a Jebusite city, sitting in the middle of the tribes of Israel. But David, under God's direction, took that stronghold and it became known as his place, his is known as the city of David, Jerusalem, the city of David. And so the pattern was established. God's people, in God's place, under God's rule. And that's the pattern that's established for the people that 1 Chronicles writes to and says to them, you may look around and it doesn't look like that. You don't look like God's people under God's king and in his place, but look forward, because the time will come when this will be your experience. And so they look forward and look forward and look forward. And we've got to go on nearly over 400 years. And then everything that God had promised took place. Because David's descendant came and he was Jesus, God's true king. Luke records to us a blind man calling out to Jesus as he passed by. And very interestingly, he uses the name, "Have mercy on me, Son of David." Here is the true king going past, the true king who establishes his kingdom through his death and resurrection. So there is God's king, the true king, King Jesus. And he gathers a people around him. But it's not just Israel. Did you notice as we read through Acts chapter 11 that Peter, the apostle, had to be really convinced that Gentiles could become part of this new kingdom as well. And he is convinced by God. And so all people, Jew and Gentile alike, can be part of this new people of God, the people who belong to Jesus. And those people live in God's kingdom, the place where God rules, no longer literally Jerusalem, but heaven itself. And the Apostle Paul will talk about Christians as being seated in the heavenlies. God's people who belong to Jesus, under God's rule, King Jesus, and in his place, seated in the heavenlies. But like the people of Israel back then, we may not necessarily see that. If you were to go around all the, I said at 8 o'clock, all the people in the houses around about having their brekkie, if you go to all the houses around, must be morning tea time. Yes, so all the houses around, people having morning tea and saying, see that building over there? That is where God, the creator of the universe, is at work. They might not believe us, but that is the case. People say sometimes, why doesn't God do something? And our response is, he has. In the person of Jesus, his king is ruling over his people in the place that he has given. We wait for that to be completely fulfilled, and the time will come when Jesus will return. The time will come when the new Jerusalem will come down out of heaven. In Revelation chapter 21 we read of that. The time will come when everybody will be gathered around, people from every tribe and nation and tongue will be gathered around the throne of God, all those who belong to the Lord Jesus. When does that happen? Well, I don't know. Lots of people have been trying to guess, but in God's time. Sometimes the future comes crashing into the present, of course. This week has been a hard one for me. A friend of ours, CMS missionary in Japan, she was only 58 and she died quite suddenly. She'd been in Dubai and then in Japan, and her funeral was last Wednesday, and the family asked if I would speak at it. And that indeed was an emotional time, difficult time. And yet we used verses that sometimes we say, oh, that's going to be in the future, I don't know. But suddenly that future can come into our own lives. I don't know. Who would know what the next 5, 10 years are going to be? But I do know that whether the Lord has come or whether we go to meet him, our great hope and joy is that great David's greater son is on the throne, that he is the king, and we are his people gathered to him from every part of the world and nation and tribe and language. We are his, and we are already seated in the heavenlies with him. And that moment of if the Lord hasn't come by the time that we face our own death, we move entirely into the fulfillment of everything that we experience now, but then fully. God's King is ruling in over God's people and in God's kingdom. And we rejoice like the people that the chronicler wrote to. Take heart, look to what God is doing, rejoice in all that we have, and then look to its fulfillment whenever that will be. Amen.